Hey guys, what is up? It is me, Pagey, here once again with another video on just this new DC Universe coming our way. So in just over 5 months from now, we will have the official introduction of the new DC Universe reboot under the creative mind of James Gunn to the wider world with the release of Superman, formerly Superman Legacy, in the middle of July. Of course, there is a lot of excitement, nerves, and I guess nervous excitement when it comes to the release of Superman. You know, what is it going to be like? How it performs, and just what it means going forward in this DC Universe reboot. Whether that is with the next film release the following year, that of course being Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, or 5 to 6 years down the line when we are maybe exploring characters that have either never been seen in film live action previously, or just touching upon characters from the former DCEU, like a Shazam for example. But one big question that many have, not when it comes to a specific film like Superman or a specific show like Peacemaker Season 2 or something like that, but the larger DC Universe as a whole, is where are we leading with all of this? Because James Gunn, when he announced that first slate or string of projects, just over 2 years ago roughly, is that his DC Universe would be the largest connected story across film, TV, and video games. Now, of course, many think that the video game aspect won't really happen at least it won't happen as prominently as previously stated, but it might have a smaller presence than originally intended. But for the sake of this video, we aren't going to really include that medium into what we're talking about here. And when people question where we are heading in this DC universe, there is probably 3 angles to it, maybe more, but I'm going to specify 3 angles. Firstly, the end of this first chapter, which Gunn of course entitled Gods and Monsters. The second being along the way after chapter 1, so in a few years after that, so essentially in the middle of the story. And finally, what's the end goal? Where would Gunn see his story, at the very least in this DC universe, wrapping up? Well, let's talk about it. But of course, you know what to do in the comment section down below. Let me know what you're thinking. And of course, if you're going to enjoy the video, drop a like. It takes 2 seconds. So the first thing to focus on is the end of chapter 1. Now, we don't necessarily know exactly when that is because we have things being added to chapter 1. Clayface, for example, Sergeant Rock. They are things that are being added to this first chapter that Gunn originally announced, but then there's been no progress, at least in regards to the public side, with things like the Authority, Booster Gold, Swamp Thing, at least in regards to major things outside of those first couple of months following Gunn taking over. But regardless of, what films or shows or maybe video games come out within chapter 1, you would assume that throughout chapter 1 that the push for the core theme and tones of the DCU will be the prominent thing, while also leaning into the outlier thing such as a Swamp Thing, if that does come out in chapter 1, which we should assume so because it was announced in that original slate. But you'd assume that whatever they're leading to, will there be some sort of groundwork put into within this first chapter, but it just depends, where it leads specifically in the first chapter as well as going forward, because we don't know, is it 3 chapters? Is it just a broad term? There's not necessarily a definitive thing, what's in chapter 1, what's in chapter 2. That's for us to wait and find out. But you would assume it'd almost be like just climbing a ladder. So there's these different things that are pushed and that are cemented in this DCU throughout the first chapter, and then at the end of that, it's almost like another stepping stone to whatever is coming at the end. But I would assume, especially based off what we've seen from Gunn and just the general feel of the universe he's building into, I can expect where we lead into in regards to the end of chapter 1 is almost like a Justice League Unlimited-esque crossover. So like that animated show Justice League Unlimited, where essentially it wasn't just a core Justice League, it was essentially every hero was a part of that Justice League. So it won't be like the Justice League film we had in 2017, where there's a core, 6 or 7 members or whatever it was. It is just like the conglomeration of heroes within the DCU. It just means that specific characters are more useful for certain situations. I mean, what's something off the top of my head? You aren't going to take Aquaman with you to the desert or an alien planet that has no water on it. You're going to take him on a mission in the middle of the ocean, where he's going to be incredibly useful on an island or something like that, or God forbid, underwater. That's what you're going to do, and there's going to be certain characters that are more suitable for, certain missions, like stealth missions or something like that. So that's where I see chapter 1 leading. I think there's not going to be a massive event film at the end of chapter 1, at least I wouldn't assume so, but there'll still be something that can have that sort of makeup, where you have at least a decent amount of heroes coming together, but it won't just be what you would expect from a core Justice League film. Now, going forward after this first chapter is where I think you could get a lot of interesting things, and where James Gunn could sort of have a bit of a funner playground to play into and have multiple events within just in just one chapter specifically, and you could really take those events from the comics and maybe attach them to the certain characters where they're suitable, or just the universe as a whole. But one thing I'd like to see, even if you just do an event from the comics, like a Blackest Night, for example, I think it might be a bit too early, like straight after chapter 1, to do Blackest Night. That might be something a further bit down the road when there's actually a bit of an emotional tie to a lot of the characters within this universe. But just like events like that, like not a crisis event, but some of those other events that bring in a bunch of characters. But you don't have to just use this for the film. You could use TV for some of these events. I think it'd be really interesting if you had an 8-episode event and it was just advertised as whatever it is. Let's just use Blackest Night for an example. And it's just an 8-episode event. And you can almost think of it, if you really want to tie it to something else from TV, like those Arrowverse crossovers, but not with this like just jumping into the middle of a season or something like that. It's like that's the advertising and there's a setup. It's almost like this very, very long extended movie. Like if it's 8 episodes, it's on HBO. It's almost like an 8-hour movie. It's like 2 4-hour, or like a 2-part. Each part is like 4 hours. It could be crazy. You could do this massive thing. Of course, would it maybe be expensive? It depends what the actual event is. You know, obviously you don't want to do anything that's too massive where the scope fits being in a cinema more, you know, suitably. Like you'd obviously just do that. But anything that's a bit smaller and maybe suits like the TV pacing, why wouldn't you do that? And especially with HBO as a platform there, it seems like such an easy thing to do. But if I had to pick one event, which I think would be a really cool event that you honestly could stretch over 2, maybe, I don't know if you'd really want to stretch it too far, but at least like maybe like a year and a half, 2 years across both the film and TV things, is the event of 52 from the comics. Now, this is an event where the Trinity is gone. They're not there. There's no Batman, there's no Superman, there's no Wonder Woman. And this not only causes the other, you know, the other higher heroes outside of the Trinity to step up, but also the lesser known heroes to either step up or just get some form of attention and recognition to begin with. Now, I think having the Trinity gone for a period of this DC universe would be a ballsy move, whether it was a large event film or just a series of film and TV projects over the course of a year or two, then leading up to an event without the Trinity. And then that maybe like reintroduces the Trinity as well. But I would love it. But it's Hollywood. There's lots of money involved. I think it would be hard for this to be approved, but I mean, wishful thinking. But I just think it'd be really interesting. Like there's just, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they die, but just something happens to them and they're just not there. There's no real answer. Maybe the event itself can be about answering that. You don't have to adapt the comic as it is. You use the concept of the comic and the event and then play around with it within that specific universe. I think that's the coolest way to do it. But of course, you'd want to establish your Batman, of course your Superman, and of course your Wonder Woman to a degree in the universe where it matters and it stands out that they're gone, not only to us, the audience, and I guess the world that we're in within those movies, but also the supporting characters that then have to rise up and take a bit more responsibility. So this isn't something that you do really, really soon, like over the next 5 or 6 years, but this is something that I'd like to see them do before you get into some like massive event stuff right at the end or towards that end goal. But this leads into the end goal. Now, of course, the thing that people are going to jump to a lot is Crisis on Infinite Earths. And yes, this would be a really cool thing to see, especially because you can bring back not only stuff from the former DCEU and have some fun there, if not give some closure to it, but of course all the other movie stuff beforehand, all the other TV stuff. Of course, we had the TV version of Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was really cool, but imagine on a movie level with all those, just the movie level, you know? You can make it a 2-parter if you, obviously, I think you'd have to make it a 2-parter to be completely honest. But obviously you could also spread it throughout those other film and TV projects around that same time, whenever it's coming out, of course. But I think there's other Crisis events beforehand that maybe people would want to jump into or just use instead of Crisis on Infinite Earths. I mean, one that's in the comics that a lot of people would want to see is an event called Infinite Crisis. Not Crisis on Infinite Earths, but Infinite Crisis. Now, in the comics, this is actually a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, but you could easily use it in a different context in regards to what's happening in that DC universe at the time. But once again, I think this is an event where you'd want to at least build a decent amount of it. It does involve like re-exploring the multiverse and stuff like that. Slash, you could actually bring it in to actually introduce the multiverse into this DC universe, depending on how Gunn wants to go along with it. And it could actually be a more suitable like reverse of Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is the multiverse becoming one. Infinite Crisis would be one Earth introducing multiple, and then you get to play around with that as well. But I think one where, if you're talking about an end goal and you're not specifically talking about Crisis on Infinite Earths, but an end goal event, which I think I think people would be into. It's big though, like it's a big event, and this is Final Crisis. Now this is as I said, a big event where Darkseid conquers not just one Earth or the Earth, he conquers the multiverse. It's arguably the biggest event scale-wise they could do alongside Crisis on Infinite Earths. I'm not saying you do both, but if you're going to, weigh up them or weigh them up, you'd choose probably between these two in regards to a massive, massive event. Even though there's things like Blackest Night, which are really big, these two I think are the big boys. So Final Crisis would be insane, but that's probably the one where you could easily call it like the Final Crisis, like saga or something, or era or chapter, whatever you want to call it, chapter 4 Final Crisis, whatever you want to call it, and it stretches across all these different things, and you could have banger after banger after banger movie and TV show come out and just all be connected. But once again, the audience would have to be committed to it. That's the biggest thing. They have to be committed to it to make that work. If I had to pick, I mean, fanboy wise and just like for the cameo sake, you'd go Crisis on Infinite Earths. Once again, the multiverse I think has to be introduced or like explored in some way. Obviously not necessarily have to have like all these different movies and shows that are being made from this point forward on different Earths, no. But you at least have to have some exploration before that, I think, to make Crisis on Infinite Earths work. But in regards to just like starting it and not really having to like do too much with the multiverse, I think Final Crisis is probably the better option because you get some of that Crisis on Infinite Earths aspects, but you don't necessarily have to explore the multiverse prior to it. But I think Final Crisis, as I said, will have to be a big event. Like, as I said, it's either like you do it in the TVs and shows throughout a year or two, or maybe even do like a 2-part movie, but also mixed in with a couple of other movies and a couple of shows as well. But the big thing around this, and I think it's a conversation people don't want to have, but I think it's an important conversation. I know it's like about, you're shaming. I don't even think it's because it's just a fact. How long will James Gunn stay at DC Studios? It's a legitimate question. I think it's a legitimate question here. He turns 59 later this year. Like, if I'm thinking like some of these movies we're getting here, like, I mean, we might not get the end of this chapter 1 for another 5 years or something like that. How long until the end of chapter 2? And then we start getting to some of that bigger stuff. Like, how old is James Gunn? When does he retire? Because I definitely don't see him doing this when he turns 70. I expect him to be a couple of years retired by that point. So it'll be very interesting to see where things progress from this point forward. As I said, he turns 59. I think it's in the middle. I think it's actually around the time Superman comes out. I think it might be just after Superman comes out. So it will be interesting. I'd assume that there's going to be like a successor that's groomed after the next few years. Like, not starting now, but maybe like shortly after like Supergirl or the Batman Part 2 comes out, or whenever that comes out, then we might see someone come in as a bit like of a like the co-position to James Gunn, and they're like the person that's look to be like the next person to take over. But then again, it just depends how DC Studios is going and stuff like that. But I think it's an important thing to think about, because it also maybe does Gunn want to do this big event before he leaves? Because then that makes you go, well, surely that means you get the big event in the next 9 to 10 years or something like that. So it'll be interesting. So I guess I'll watch this space in regards to that. Not shaming James Gunn's age. It's just a fact. And you just look at it, it's like, surely he doesn't do it once he's into his 70s. But yeah, guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, it'd be awesome if you could drop a like on it, show support. Let me know in the comment section down below your various opinions on everything we went over. Always curious where you guys are thinking. And if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you guys later. Goodbye.